everyone. Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the world of, well, you guessed it, the human nervous system.
And specifically for you, this time we'll be focusing on.
Right. This is tailored for our listener today using their biology textbook
Yeah.
as a guide.
So we're really diving deep into the source material here.
Exactly. And really, I mean, this is so fascinating because the nervous system really controls everything you do, right? I mean, from breathing to thinking and feeling and moving your muscles and everything.
It's really incredible how the system managed to coordinate all the different parts of the body, making sure everything works together, kind of like a perfectly choreographed dance. But instead of dancers, you have billions of tiny cells called neurons.
Billions with a B. Huh. Well, that's a lot of dancers. So where are all these neurons hanging out?
Well, you could think about it this way. You have the central nervous system that's kind of like the director's booth, calling all the shots. And that's your brain and spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves branching out from the CNS. And that's like the stage crew carrying messages back and forth.
Okay, between the director and the performers.
Exactly.
Got it. So the brain is sending out the cues and the nerves are carrying the instructions to the muscles. I'm starting to see the big picture here.
Exactly. And those messages travel through two main types of nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system. They're called afferent and efferent.
Okay.
Afferent fibers carry signals to the CNS, like status updates from the body.
Okay.
And efferent fibers carry signals away from the CNS. So those are the commands telling the muscles what to do.
So it's a two-way communication system. Fascinating, but it's not just about moving though, right?
Yeah.
Well, what about all the things that our body does automatically, like breathing or digesting food?
That's where the autonomic nervous system comes in. Takes care of all that behind-the-scenes action, regulating things like your heartbeat, breathing, and digestion. All those functions you don't have to consciously control.
Okay, so it's like a dedicated crew managing all the stage lights and sound effects while the main performance is going on.
Perfect analogy. And there's another fascinating player here, the visceral nervous system.
Okay.
This one specifically connects the central nervous system to your internal organs, constantly monitoring and adjusting their functions.
So even when we're not even thinking about it, our nervous system is working tirelessly behind the scenes. It's like having a personal assistant that never takes a break.
Absolutely. And all this is made possible by those tiny dancers we mentioned earlier, the neurons. They are the fundamental unit of the nervous system, and they're specialized to detect, receive, and transmit all those signals throughout your body.
Okay, so let's zoom in on these star performers. What exactly do they look like, and how do they work their magic?
You can imagine a neuron as a tiny tree with three main parts.
Okay.
The cell body is like the trunk containing the neuron's nucleus and all the essential components. That's the neuron's control center.
Okay, and then the branches. Are
Yeah.
those the dendrites?
Exactly. Dendrites are branching extensions that receive signals from other neurons, kind of like antennas picking up information.
So the dendrites are receiving messages? Is that how the communication happens?
It's a key part of the process. Now imagine that tree also has a single long root extending from the cell body. That's the axon. It's like a cable transmitting signals away from the cell body to other neurons or to muscles or to glands.
So the dendrites receive, and then the axon sends it on to the next destination, like a relay race.
Precisely. Now some of these axons are covered in a fatty substance called myelin. It's like insulation on an electrical wire. And it speeds up the transmission of those nerve impulses, which is especially important for things like quick reflexes and movements.
So myelin's like giving those signals a super fast lane to travel in.
You got it. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The signals traveling along the neurons aren't like messages in a bottle. They're actually tiny electrical impulses.
Nice electrical impulses.
Yeah.
Inside our bodies. Tell me more.
So a resting neuron maintains what we call a polarized state, which means there's a difference in electrical charge between the inside and the outside of the cell. It's like a battery storing potential energy.
Okay, so the neuron is charged up, ready to go. But how does that electrical signal actually get triggered?
When a neuron receives a strong enough stimulus, it's like flipping a switch. The cell membrane suddenly becomes permeable to sodium ions, which rush into the cell.
Okay.
Now, because sodium ions have a positive charge, this influx changes the electrical charge inside the cell.
So it's like a sudden surge of electricity?
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this rapid change in electrical charge is called depolarization. And that's what triggers the action potential, the nerve impulse itself.
So depolarization creates the nerve impulse.
Exactly. And this impulse travels down the axon, like a tiny wave of electrical activity carrying the signal from one end of the neuron to the other.
Wow, so it's like a chain reaction happening really fast.
You're getting it. And
Yeah.
once that impulse passes, the neuron needs to reset itself so it can fire again. That's where repolarization comes in. Potassium ions flow out of the cell, restoring the original electrical balance, and now the neuron's ready for the next signal.
So depolarization creates the signal and repolarization resets the system. It's like a perfectly coordinated dance of electrical charges.
Excellent way to visualize it. But the dance doesn't stop there. We still need to figure out how these signals get passed from one neuron to the next,
Right.
and that's where synapses come in.
Synapses, those are the junctions where neurons communicate with each other, right? So they're like tiny meeting points for these signals.
Precisely. Synapses are crucial for transmitting information between neurons, and there are two main types, electrical synapses and chemical synapses.
Okay.
Let's start with the simpler one, electrical synapses. You can imagine them as direct connections between neurons, where ions can flow directly from one to the next, like an instant message.
So it's like a direct line of communication, no need for a messenger. That sounds really fast.
It is incredibly fast, and it allows for synchronized activity between neurons. But most synapses in our nervous system are actually chemical synapses.
Chemical synapses, what makes them different?
At a chemical synapse, the arrival of an action potential at the end of an axon triggers the release of special chemicals called neurotransmitters.
So instead of a direct connection, there's a chemical messenger involved.
Exactly. These neurotransmitters act as couriers, carrying the signal across the synaptic cleft, that small gap between the two neurons.
And what happens when the neurotransmitter reaches the other side?
It binds to a specific receptor on the receiving neuron, kind of like a key fitting into a lock.
Ah.
And depending on the type of neurotransmitter and receptor, this binding can either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron, so it influences whether a new action potential is generated.
So it's not just a simple on-off switch. There's a lot more nuance in how these signals are transmitted.
Absolutely. And the variety of neurotransmitters is astonishing. Each has its own specific role. It's like a complex language
Wow.
that governs our thoughts, emotions, and actions.
This is so intricate. I'm starting to see why understanding the nervous system is like trying to decipher a complex code.
It certainly is a fascinating challenge.
Yeah.
And we've only just begun to explore this incredible world of neural communication. But before we delve further into that, let's shift our focus to the brain, the command center of this whole operation.
The brain? Now, that's a topic I'm excited to unpack. I've always been fascinated by how this wrinkled organ controls everything we do.
It is remarkable, isn't it? And despite its complexity, we can break down the brain into three main parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain.
3 major sections. What makes each of these parts unique? Where do we even begin with something as complex as the brain?
Let's start with the forebrain. It's the largest and most evolutionarily advanced part of the brain, and it's responsible for all those higher-level functions that make us human.
Higher level cognitive functions. So we're talking about thinking, learning, making decisions.
Exactly. The forebrain is home to the cerebrum, the wrinkled outer layer that you probably picture when you think of a brain.
Right, the iconic image of the brain with all the folds and grooves. But why is it so wrinkled?
Those wrinkles actually serve a purpose. They increase the surface area of the cerebrum, which allows for a greater density of neurons.
Ah, so it's like packing more processing power into a limited space. Clever.
And the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, left and right, each controlling the opposite side of the body.
So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and vice versa.
Interesting. Do both hemispheres do the same things, or do they have specialized roles?
While they work together seamlessly, they do have some specialized functions.
Okay.
For example, the left hemisphere is typically dominant for language processing.
So that's why people say the left brain is more analytical and logical.
While those generalizations are definitely oversimplifications, the left hemisphere's role in language does contribute to those perceptions.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is more involved in spatial awareness, creativity, and recognizing faces.
So the right hemisphere helps us appreciate art, navigate our surroundings, remember who we're talking to. Exactly. And these two hemispheres communicate constantly with each other through a thick band of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum, constantly sharing information and making sure that both sides are in sync.
It's like they have their own private communication channel. Amazing. But there's more to the cerebrum than just the two hemispheres, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We also have the cerebral cortex, which is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. Think of it as the executive suite of the brain where the most complex cognitive functions happen.
So it's the cerebral cortex that allows us to think critically, solve problems, plan for the future.
Precisely. And the cerebral cortex is further divided into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Each lobe has its own set of specialized functions, and they all work together to create our conscious experience.
Okay, 4 lobes each with a specific role. This is starting to sound like a well-organized company with different departments handling different tasks.
That's a helpful analogy.
Yeah.
Now, the frontal lobe, which is located right at the front of your head, is like the CEO of the brain. It's involved in planning, decision-making, problem-solving, working memory, and even things like impulse control.
So if I'm trying to resist that extra slice of cake, it's my frontal lobe that's helping me exercise willpower.
That's right. And the frontal lobe also plays a crucial role in our personality and social behavior.
It shapes who we are as people
Absolutely.
and how we interact with others. Fascinating. What about the other lobes? What are their areas of expertise?
Well, the parietal lobe sits behind the frontal lobe, and it's like the brain's sensory processing center.
Okay.
It receives input from all of our senses and helps us make sense of our surroundings. So it's involved in processing touch, temperature, pain, and pressure. And it also plays a role in spatial awareness, navigation, and attention.
Okay, so if I'm feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin or trying to find my way around a new city, it's my parietal lobe that's helping me process those experiences.
Exactly. And within the parietal lobe, we have what's called the somatosensory cortex.
The somatosensory cortex, is that anything like the motor cortex?
You're right to make that connection. Just like the motor cortex controls our movements, the somatosensory cortex allows us to feel sensations from different parts of our body.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that the size of the area dedicated to a particular body part in the somatosensory cortex actually reflects the sensitivity of that part.
So our fingertips, which are super sensitive to touch, would have a larger representation than, say, our elbows.
Precisely. That's why we can feel such subtle differences in texture with our fingertips.
That makes so much sense.
Yep.
Okay, 2 lobes down, 2 to go. What about the temporal lobe? What's its specialty?
The temporal lobe is located on the sides of the head near your ears,
Okay.
and it's primarily involved in auditory processing, language comprehension, and memory formation.
Ah, so it's the brain's sound and language center.
That's one way to think about it. It contains the auditory cortex, which processes sounds, and Wernicke's area, which is crucial for understanding language.
So when I hear a word, the signal travels to my auditory cortex in the temporal lobe and then to Wernicke's area to be interpreted.
That's the general idea. Of course, language processing is a complex process that involves many different areas of the brain working together, but the temporal lobe plays a key role. And speaking of complex processes, the temporal lobe is also heavily involved in memory formation.
Memory. That's another fascinating aspect of the brain. So the temporal lobe helps us remember what we've heard, seen, and experienced.
It does. And it doesn't stop there. The temporal lobe also connects those memories to emotions,
Interesting.
making them more meaningful and easier to recall.
So those vivid childhood memories that still evoke strong feeling.
Exactly. It's the temporal lobe that's weaving those emotions into the fabric of our memories.
Wow. It's what gives our memories depth and richness. Now we've covered 3 of the 4 lobes. Any guesses on what the last one, the occipital lobe, might be responsible for? I think we've got movement sensation, sound language memory. What's left?
Vision? Is that it?
You nailed it.
Yes.
The occipital lobe is located at the back of the head, and it's primarily responsible for processing all that visual information.
It contains the visual cortex, which receives input from our eyes and interprets it into the images that we see.
So it's like the brain's movie screen constantly projecting the world around us.
That's a great analogy. The occipital lobe helps us recognize objects, perceive colors, and understand spatial relationships in our visual field.
Wow. So we've covered all 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. It's amazing how each one has its own unique function, yet they all work together seamlessly.
It's a beautiful example of teamwork and coordination.
Yeah.
But remember, these lobes don't work in isolation. They're constantly communicating with each other and with other parts of the brain to create that unified experience.
So it's not just a bunch of separate parts. It's a complex and interconnected system with everything working together.
Exactly. And that's what makes the brain so fascinating and challenging to study.
Okay, so we've talked about the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, but there are other important structures within the forebrain as well, right? What else is happening behind the scenes in this CEO level part of the brain?
You're right, there's more to explore. Beneath the cerebrum, we have the thalamus, which acts as a relay station for sensory information,
Okay.
directing it to the appropriate areas of the cortex for processing. It's like a central hub, routing those incoming signals to their destinations.
So all the sensory information from our eyes, ears, skin, all of it passes through the thalamus before reaching the cortex.
Precisely. It's like a filter, ensuring that only the most relevant information gets through
Ah.
to avoid overwhelming the cortex.
And right below the thalamus, what's located there?
Right below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, a tiny but very powerful structure involved in regulating our basic drives and maintaining homeostasis.
Homeostasis. That sounds important. What exactly does it mean?
Homeostasis is all about maintaining a stable internal environment within the body.
Okay.
And the hypothalamus is essential for that balance. It controls things like hunger, thirst, body temperature, sleep-wake cycles, and even hormone release.
So it's like the brain's internal thermostat keeping everything running smoothly.
It is remarkable. The hypothalamus is constantly monitoring our internal environment and making adjustments to ensure our bodies function optimally.
So the hypothalamus keeps our basic needs in check. But I have a feeling it's not just about our physical needs, right? Doesn't it also play a role in our emotional responses?
You're absolutely right. The hypothalamus is part of what we call the limbic system, a network of structures involved in emotions, motivation, and memory.
Okay, the limbic system. So that's like the emotional heart of the brain.
That's a great way to put it. The hypothalamus, along with other structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, helps us process and respond to emotional stimuli.
Wow. So our feelings, memories, and motivations are all intertwined within this limbic system. It's like the control center for our inner world.
It is. And understanding how the limbic system works can provide valuable insights into human behavior and our emotional experiences.
Okay, so we've covered the main structures of the forebrain. The cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. We've explored how they controlled our thoughts, sensations, motivations, and emotions. It's like we've mapped out the executive branch of the brain.
A great analogy.
But the brain isn't just about higher-level thinking. We still need to explore the midbrain and the hindbrain, the regions responsible for our more fundamental functions.
Right.
We can't forget about the parts that keep us alive and functioning on a basic level. What role do the midbrain and hindbrain play in this intricate orchestra?
Well, let's start with the midbrain, a smaller region that sits between the forebrain and the hindbrain. Think of it as a bridge.
A bridge connecting what?
It's involved in visual and auditory reflexes as well as controlling eye movements and pupil dilation. It also acts as a relay center, transmitting information between the forebrain and the hindbrain.
So it's helping us react quickly to sights and sounds, controlling how our eyes move and focus, and ensuring smooth communication between the different parts of the brain. It's like the traffic controller
Exactly.
for our senses and motor responses.
And within the midbrain, we have structures like the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, which play a crucial role in those visual and auditory reflexes.
The superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, what do those do?
The superior colliculi are involved in visual reflexes like tracking moving objects and directing our gaze. Imagine you're watching a tennis match and your eyes effortlessly follow the ball as it flies across the court.
Mm-hmm.
That's your superior colliculi in action.
Ah, so it helps us focus on what's important in our visual field.
Precisely. Meanwhile, the inferior colliculi are involved in auditory reflexes, like turning our heads toward a sudden sound.
Okay.
Think about how you instinctively turn your head when you hear a loud noise. That's your inferior colliculi at work.
So these structures are constantly scanning our environment, helping us react quickly to potential threats or opportunities.
Exactly. They're essential for our survival, allowing us to respond appropriately to changes in our surroundings.
It's amazing how much is happening in the midbrain without us even realizing it. We're constantly taking in information, processing it, and reacting, all thanks to this incredible network of neural pathways.
It's testament to the efficiency and complexity of the nervous system. And we still have one more region to explore, the hindbrain.
The hindbrain, that's the most primitive part of the brain, right? But I imagine it still plays a vital role in keeping us alive and functioning.
You're absolutely right. The hindbrain contains structures that control our most basic life functions, things like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure.
Wow, so it's responsible for keeping us alive on a fundamental level. What are the key players in this region?
Within the hindbrain, we have the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata.
Okay, 3 important structures. Let's start with the cerebellum. What's its role in this life-sustaining trio?
The cerebellum, located at the back of the brain, is like the brain's balance and coordination center. Think of it as our internal gyroscope, helping us maintain our posture, walk smoothly, and perform complex movements.
So if I'm trying to learn a new dance move or ride a bike, it's my cerebellum that's helping me coordinate those movements.
Exactly. It receives input from our senses and from the motor cortex, and helps to fine-tune our movements, making them smooth and precise.
It's like having a personal choreographer inside our heads, making sure we don't trip over our own feet. What about the pons?
Yeah.
What role does it play?
The pons sits above the medulla and acts as a relay station between the cerebrum and the cerebellum.
Okay.
It also plays a role in sleep breathing and swallowing.
So it's facilitating communication between those higher level thinking centers in the cerebrum and the movement control centers of the cerebellum. And on top of that, it's helping regulate essential functions like breathing and swallowing.
That's right. It's a busy little structure ensuring that information flows smoothly and our basic bodily processes continue uninterrupted.
Okay, we've covered the cerebellum and the pons. What about the last member of the hindbrain trio, the medulla oblongata?
The medulla oblongata is located at the base of the brain where it connects to the spinal cord, and it's responsible for controlling our most vital functions, things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, swallowing, and even vomiting.
Wow, so it's truly the control center for keeping us alive. That's a lot of responsibility for one structure.
It is, and any damage to the medulla oblongata can be life-threatening.
That's incredible. So we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the structure and function of the brain from the complex cerebrum to the life-sustaining hindbrain. It's amazing to think about how all these different parts work together to create our conscious experience.
It's truly a marvel of biological engineering.
But we've only just scratched the surface of understanding this incredible complexity of the nervous system, and there's still so much more to discover.
Absolutely.
We've explored the brain, the command center, but what about those nerves branching out, carrying messages throughout the body? We need to dive deeper into the peripheral nervous system.
Absolutely. That's what we'll pick up next time, uncovering how the brain communicates with the rest of the body and how we control all of our voluntary and involuntary actions. Welcome back to our deep dive into the nervous system. Before we move on to the peripheral nervous system, I thought we could circle back to the neurons for a moment. Remember how we talked about them being in a polarized state, kind of like a battery storing energy?
Yes, you said that difference in electrical charge is maintained by the sodium-potassium pump, but I admit that part went a little over my head. Could you break it down for me like I'm 5?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine the neuron cell membrane as a busy border crossing. The sodium-potassium pump is like a diligent border guard, constantly working to keep the right number of sodium ions outside the cell and potassium ions inside. It's a bit of a 2-for-1 deal, pumping 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions it brings in.
Okay, so it's like maintaining order at the border, making sure everyone's in the right place. But why is that so important for the neuron to function properly?
This separation of charges creates an electrical potential difference across the membrane. It's like charging up a battery, creating the potential energy needed for the neuron to fire when it receives a signal.
So the sodium-potassium pump is like a tiny generator constantly working to keep the neuron powered up and ready for action.
That's a great way to think about it. And this powered up state is what we call the resting potential. But the real excitement begins when a neuron receives a strong enough signal to trigger an impulse.
Right. You talked about depolarization, how sodium ions rush into the cell, causing a rapid change in the electrical charge. It's like a sudden surge of electricity. But how does that trigger a signal that travels all the way down the axon?
Think of it like a line of dominoes. When a stimulus hits that first domino, it tips over, setting off a chain reaction all the way down the line. Similarly, when sodium ions flood into a section of the neuron, it depolarizes that section, triggering the next section to depolarize and so on.
So the signal is like a wave of depolarization traveling down the axon.
You got it. This wave is the action potential, the nerve impulse itself, carrying the message from one end of the neuron to the other.
Okay, so depolarization is like tipping over that first domino, initiating the nerve impulse. But what happens afterward? How does the neuron reset itself?
After the impulse passes, the neuron needs to restore its resting potential. It's like setting those dominoes back up so they can fall again. This resetting process is called repolarization. Potassium channels in the membrane open up, allowing potassium ions to flow out of the cell.
So potassium flowing out is like setting those dominoes back up, preparing the neuron to fire again.
Precisely. This outflow of positive charges helps restore the negative charge inside the neuron, getting it back to its resting potential.
It's fascinating how the neuron can switch between these states so quickly, firing off signals and resetting itself all in a fraction of a second.
It is a remarkable process. And this entire cycle of depolarization and repolarization allows neurons to fire, repeatedly transmitting information throughout the nervous system with incredible speed and precision.
Okay, so we've got these electrical signals zipping along the neurons, but they don't travel forever, right? How do they get passed on to the next neuron in line? Back to those synapses we were discussing.
You're exactly right. Synapses are the key to communication between neurons. Remember, there are two main types of synapses, electrical and chemical. Electrical synapses are those super fast direct connections we talked about, where ions flow directly from one neuron to the next.
Right, like instant messaging between neurons. What about the chemical synapses? They're a bit more complex, aren't they?
They are. At a chemical synapse, the electrical signal reaching the end of an axon triggers the release of those chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters.
So it's like the electrical signal is converted into a chemical signal.
Exactly. These neurotransmitters are stored in tiny sacs called vesicles at the end of the axon. When the signal arrives, those vesicles release their neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, the tiny gap between the two neurons.
So those neurotransmitters are like tiny boats carrying messages across the gap.
That's a great visual. On the other side of the gap, the receiving neuron has specialized receptors, each designed to bind with a specific type of neurotransmitter. It's like a lock and key system. Only the right key can open the lock.
So if a neurotransmitter doesn't match the receptor, the message won't get through.
Precisely. This ensures that signals are transmitted with high specificity, preventing any mix-ups or misinterpretations. And once a neurotransmitter binds to its receptor, it triggers a series of events that can either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron, influencing whether a new action potential is generated.
So the neurotransmitters aren't just delivering messages, they're also influencing how those messages are received and interpreted.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, with each neurotransmitter playing a specific role. For example, dopamine is involved in feelings of pleasure and reward, while serotonin plays a role in mood regulation and sleep.
Wow, it's like a complex dance of chemicals influencing everything from our emotions and behaviors to our sleep patterns and even our ability to learn and remember.
It really is. And this dance is constantly changing, adapting to our experiences and the demands of our environment.
So it's not just about the structure of the nervous system, it's also about the dynamic interplay of these chemicals within it.
Precisely. And that interplay is what makes understanding the nervous system such a fascinating challenge. We've explored the intricate world of neurons, the electrical signals they generate, and the chemical messengers they use to communicate. Now it's time to zoom out and take a closer look at how the brain connects to and interacts with the rest of the body.
The peripheral nervous system, I'm ready to dive into that vast communication network you mentioned earlier. It's the bridge between our brain and the world around us, right?
Exactly. Remember, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is made up of all the nerves extending from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. It's like a massive highway system carrying messages back and forth.
Okay, so the PNS is the communication infrastructure. But I remember you mentioned two main divisions within it, the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. What are the key differences between them?
Think of it this way. The somatic nervous system is responsible for voluntary actions, while the autonomic nervous system handles the involuntary ones.
Voluntary versus involuntary. So if I decide to pick up my coffee mug, that's my somatic nervous system in action. But my heart beating or my stomach digesting food, that's the autonomic nervous system doing its thing.
You've got it. The somatic nervous system connects the brain to our skeletal muscles, allowing us to consciously control our movements. When you decide to walk, talk, or reach for something, it's the somatic nervous system carrying those signals from your brain to the muscles making it happen.
So the somatic nervous system is like the puppeteer, and our muscles are the puppets responding to the brain's commands.
That's a great way to put it. Now, the autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, is responsible for all the functions we don't have to think about. It regulates the functions of our internal organs, keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes.
Like an invisible stage crew, ensuring the show goes on without a hitch.
Precisely. And the autonomic nervous system is further divided into two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. You can think of them as two sides of a coin constantly working together to maintain balance within the body.
Two sides of a coin. Interesting. What does each side represent?
Well, the sympathetic nervous system is often referred to as the fight or flight system. It kicks in when we're faced with a stressful or dangerous situation, preparing our bodies for action.
So it's like our body's emergency response team getting us ready to either confront the danger or run away from it.
Exactly. It increases heart rate, speeds up breathing, diverts blood flow to our muscles, and releases hormones like adrenaline, giving us that surge of energy we need to react quickly.
Wow, this sounds intense. What about the parasympathetic nervous system? What's its role in this balancing act?
The parasympathetic nervous system is all about rest and digest. It's the calming force promoting relaxation and slowing things down after the sympathetic nervous system has done its job.
So it's like the cool down period after an intense workout, helping our bodies recover and return to a state of equilibrium.
Exactly. It slows our heart rate, lowers blood pressure, promotes digestion, and conserves energy. It's all about restoring balance and promoting homeostasis within the body.
This interplay between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems is fascinating. It's like a constant push and pull, ensuring our bodies are always prepared for whatever challenges or moments of calm come our way.
Exactly. And this balance is crucial for our overall health and well-being. When one system dominates for too long, it can lead to various problems. For example, chronic stress can keep the sympathetic nervous system activated, leading to anxiety, sleep disturbances, and digestive issues.
So finding ways to manage stress and activate the parasympathetic nervous system is essential.
Absolutely. Techniques like meditation, deep breathing, and yoga can help shift the balance towards the parasympathetic nervous system, promoting relaxation and reducing the negative effects of stress.
It's amazing how much control we have over our own nervous system. We're not just passive passengers. We can actively influence our internal state and create a sense of balance and well-being. But what about those situations where we don't have conscious control, like reflexes? How do those work?
Reflexes are fascinating. They're rapid involuntary responses to stimuli designed to protect us from harm, and they often bypass the brain altogether.
Wait, they bypass the brain? How is that possible? I thought the brain was in charge of everything.
While the brain is the ultimate command center, some responses need to happen incredibly fast, too fast for the brain to process and issue commands. That's where the spinal cord steps in.
Okay, so the spinal cord can make decisions on its own.
In a way, yes. For reflexes, sensory information travels to the spinal cord, which then sends out a motor command directly to the muscles, bypassing the brain entirely.
So it's like having a backup control center that can react quickly in emergencies.
Exactly. Think about what happens when you touch something hot. You instantly pull your hand away before you even consciously register the pain. That's a reflex arc in action, protecting you from a burn.
Wow, that's incredible. So we've got this amazing interplay between the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, all working together to control our movements, regulate our internal environment, and protect us from harm.
It's a remarkable system. And we've only just begun to explore the complexities of how it all works. There's still so much more to discover.
I'm already feeling overwhelmed by how much I've learned, but I'm also incredibly curious to know more. What are some of the big questions that neuroscientists are still trying to answer?
Yeah, it really is mind-boggling to think about what we don't know when it comes to the nervous system. So what are some of the big mysteries that neuroscientists are still trying to figure out?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is understanding consciousness. Like, how does this network of neurons give rise to our experiences, our thoughts and our feelings in that sense of self? It's a question that has philosophers and scientists scratching their heads. Yeah, how do those physical processes in the brain create something as intangible as consciousness? I imagine that's a tough one to solve.
It certainly is. And then you have the challenge of understanding how the brain changes over time, how it learns and adapts to new experiences. We know that the brain is incredibly plastic. It's constantly rewiring itself in response to the world around us, but we're just beginning to understand those mechanisms behind that plasticity and how we can actually harness it to enhance things like learning and memory and recovery from brain injuries.
So if we could unlock those secrets, we could potentially develop new therapies for things like stroke or Alzheimer's.
It would be revolutionary. And then there's the ongoing quest to develop better treatments for mental health disorders, things like depression and anxiety. We're learning more about the complex interplay of genetics and brain chemistry and environmental factors that contribute to these conditions. But there's still so much that we don't understand.
It sounds like neuroscience is a field with endless possibilities for discovery. It must be an exciting time to be working in such a rapidly evolving area of research.
It's incredibly exciting. Every new finding opens up a whole new set of questions, and the potential for really improving human health and well-being is immense.
I have to say, this deep dive into the nervous system has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I have a new appreciation for the symphony that's happening inside my own body.
I'm glad to hear that. It really is a remarkable system, and even with all that we do know, there's just always more to learn and explore.
Speaking of exploring, is there anything that you would recommend for someone who wants to delve a little deeper into this subject? Any books or documentaries, websites you'd suggest?
Oh, absolutely. There's some fantastic resources out there for anyone who's interested in learning more about the brain and nervous system. A classic book that's both accessible and engaging is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. It's a collection of case studies about patients with neurological disorders, and it really highlights the incredible complexity and resilience of the brain.
Oh, I've heard of that book. I've always wanted to check it out.
I highly recommend it. And for a more visual experience, the documentary series The Brain with David Eagleman is excellent. It covers a wide range of topics from perception and memory to consciousness and decision-making using stunning visuals and compelling storytelling.
Ooh, I'll have to add that to my watch list. What about websites? Any reliable online resources that you suggest?
Yeah, for trustworthy, up-to-date information, I always recommend websites like brainfacts.org and neurosciencenews.com. They're both run by reputable organizations, and they have articles and videos and interactive content that break down complex neuroscience concepts in a way that's easy to understand.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've covered just about everything in this incredible journey through the nervous system. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listener with?
Just never underestimate the power and complexity of your own nervous system. It's a constantly evolving, adapting, just awe-inspiring network that orchestrates every aspect of your being. From the simplest reflexes to the most profound thoughts and emotions, it's all thanks to this incredible web of communication within you.
Well said. Well, this deep dive was crafted just for you, and we hope it's ignited a spark of curiosity about this incredible world inside your own body. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep marveling at the wonders of the human nervous system.